The Salt River was not a body of water today. It was a churning artery of liquid mud, broken branches, and freezing winter ice. The roar of the flash flood swallowed the sound of the wind, shaking the red canyon walls with mindless fury. Elu stood waist-deep in the violent current, the freezing water biting into her flesh like shattered glass. Her breathing came in shallow, jagged gasps. Her arms, trembling with an exhaustion that settled deep into her bones, were raised high above the rushing surface. In them, she held her 4-year-old son, Leo. "Mama," the boy whimpered, his voice barely carrying over the deafening roar of the river. His small fingers dug into the torn collar of her calico dress. "Hold on to me," Elu whispered, her teeth chattering so violently she could taste the metallic tang of blood in her mouth. "Do not look at the water, Leo. Look at me." But her strength was failing. The water tore at the hem of her ruined dress, pulling her deeper into the muddy vortex. Every step backward toward the shore was met with a brutal surge of the current, and she could not go back. On the muddy ridge behind them, a group of men sat comfortably on their horses. They wore heavy dusters and carried rifles resting lazily across their saddles. At their center was Deacon Miller, a bounty hunter whose cruel smile was hidden beneath the brim of a black preacher's hat. He wasn't shooting. He didn't need to. He was simply waiting for the freezing water to snap the Apache woman's strength, forcing her to crawl back to the mud, where he would slap in the irons and drag them both back to the settlement like captured animals. "Give it up, girl." Deacon's voice drifted down, carried by the mocking wind. "The river's gonna take you both. Just walk on back here. I promise the boy won't suffer much." Elu squeezed her eyes shut, a tear freezing instantly on her bronze cheek. She tightened her grip on Leo. She would rather let the river take them both than hand her child over to men who viewed him as nothing more than a bounty printed on a piece of paper. As the boy shivered against her neck, his tiny hands lost their grip. The small carved wooden horse he had clutched for 3 days of relentless pursuit slipped from his frozen fingers. It splashed into the violent current and was instantly swept away by the gray foam. Leo let out a broken, desperate cry, reaching out for it. The sudden shift in weight caused Elu's boots to slip on the slick riverbed. She plunged forward, the icy water surging up to her chest. She screamed, hauling Leo up by his armpits, swallowing a mouthful of foul, gritty water. The cold was a physical weight pressing down on her lungs. She was losing. The river was going to win. But across the raging expanse, on the opposite bank, where the men on the ridge couldn't easily see, a lone figure sat atop a massive roan Mustang. Hayes Corlett had been tracking a herd of wild horses since dawn. He was a man made of the same harsh elements as the territory: sharp cheekbones, a weathered jaw, and pale blue eyes that missed nothing. He wore a faded denim shirt and a worn canvas coat, a braided horsehair bracelet resting against his wrist. He was a man who preferred the company of untamed beasts to the treacherous nature of men. He saw the men on the ridge. He saw the cruel patience in their posture. Then his sharp eyes tracked down to the swirling mud. He saw the woman. He saw the small, terrified child held above the flood. Most men in the territory would have tipped their hats and ridden on. Frontier law dictated that a man minded his own business, especially when a bounty hunter like Deacon Miller was involved. An Apache woman and a half-blood child meant trouble. It meant bullets. Hayes did not care about frontier law. He cared about the fact that a mother was freezing to death while men laughed. His jaw tightened. Without a single word, he spurred his Mustang. The powerful horse lunged forward, plunging down the steep embankment and crashing into the raging water. The impact sent a massive spray of freezing mud into the air. Deacon and his men on the ridge bolted upright in their saddles, shouting in confusion as they spotted the rider charging directly into the flood. "Hey, get back, you fool!" Deacon roared, raising his rifle, but the wind tore his warning to shreds. Hayes ignored them. He kept his eyes locked on Elu. The water rose to his horse's chest, the current fighting fiercely to drag the animal downstream. But Hayes was a Mustanger. He knew how to move with an animal, how to anchor his weight, how to force a path through chaos. Elu gasped, her chest heaving as she saw the massive horse tearing through the water toward her. Fear flared in her dark eyes. Another white man, another enemy. She instinctively tried to back away, shielding Leo, but her legs were completely numb. She stumbled again. Before she could go under, a strong, calloused hand clamped onto her wrist. The grip was iron-tight, but remarkably steady. Elu looked up, choking on the cold air, and met Hayes's pale blue eyes. There was no pity in them. There was no cruelty either. There was only absolute, unyielding focus. "Hand me the boy," Hayes ordered. His voice was a low, rough gravel that somehow cut cleanly through the roar of the flood. Elu hesitated, her maternal instinct screaming to keep her child close. "Now," Hayes commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Before the undertow takes you both." A violent surge of water slammed into Elu's back, nearly breaking her spine. She had no choice. With the last ounce of her failing strength, she hoisted Leo up. Hayes leaned dangerously far off his saddle, grabbing the boy by his thick coat, and hauled him up with one smooth, powerful motion, planting the child safely in front of him on the saddle horn. "Grab my stirrup," Hayes yelled to Elu. She lunged for the thick leather strap, just as her feet completely lost contact with the riverbed. She hung on, her knuckles turning white, her body dragging through the freezing water as Hayes turned the Mustang back toward the far shore. On the ridge, Deacon Miller cursed violently, firing a shot into the air. "I'll kill you, you son of a bitch! They're my bounty!" Hayes didn't even look back. He leaned low over Leo, shielding the shivering boy with his broad shoulders, and urged the Mustang forward. They were 10 yards from the safety of the rocky bank. 5 yards. Then, a massive, uprooted pine tree, carried by the blind fury of the flood, crested the water just upstream. It was barreling directly toward them like a wooden battering ram. Hayes saw it a fraction of a second too late. He yanked the reins hard, trying to pivot the Mustang, but the current was too thick. The heavy roots of the dead tree slammed into the horse's flank. The world turned into a chaotic blur of freezing mud, screaming wood, and roaring water, as all three of them were violently thrown into the black, churning mouth of the river. The shock of the freezing water was a physical blow, driving the air from Hayes's lungs as the river swallowed them whole. The world dissolved into a roaring black chaos of crushing pressure and violently tumbling debris. Under the surface, Hayes did not panic. His instincts, honed by years of surviving the brutal territory, took over. He kicked hard against the swirling undertow, his hands blindly searching the freezing darkness. His fingers brushed against heavy, soaked wool. He grabbed it, feeling the small, rigid body of the child inside the coat. Gripping Leo tight against his chest, Hayes fought his way upward, breaking the surface with a desperate gasp for air. The current was dragging them rapidly downstream, smashing them against submerged rocks. Through the blinding spray, Hayes spotted Elu. She had managed to grab hold of a jagged root protruding from the rocky eastern bank, but the river was violently trying to tear her away. Hayes kicked toward the shore, using the momentum of the current to slam his boots onto the slippery gravel shelf just below her. He shoved Leo up onto the dry, jagged rocks, out of the river's reach. Then he turned back, plunging his hands back into the freezing water to grab Elu's wrists. She was completely spent, her eyes rolling back, her fingers slipping from the slick wood. With a guttural grunt of effort, Hayes dug his heels into the mud, locked his shoulders, and hauled her out of the roaring flood. Elu collapsed onto the sharp stones, coughing up muddy water, her body shaking so violently she could barely draw breath. Beside her, Leo was curled into a tight, shivering ball, crying silently. Hayes did not stop to rest. He immediately stood, his pale eyes scanning the opposite bank through the driving sleet. Across the impassable, churning expanse of the salt river, Deacon Miller sat on his horse, his face twisted in a mask of pure rage. The flood had widened, creating a deadly barrier of raging water and smashed timber between them. The bounty hunter raised his rifle and fired a shot into the gray sky, screaming curses that were instantly swallowed by the storm. They couldn't cross. Not today. Hayes had bought them time. A sharp whinny brought Hayes's attention down the bank. His Mustang had managed to scramble ashore a few dozen yards downstream, shaking the freezing water from its thick coat. The horse was scraped but unbroken. Ha! Yes, turned back to the mother and child. Elu was trying to pull herself up, her torn calico dress plastered to her freezing skin, her lips tinted a dangerous shade of blue. She pulled Leo to her chest, her dark, fierce eyes locking onto Hayes. She was waiting for the demand, the price. In her world, no man risked his life for an Apache woman without exacting a heavy toll. But Hayes simply walked past her, retrieving his horse. He led the massive beast over to where she sat on the frozen stones. "Get up," he said, his voice stripped of any emotion. Elu flinched, her arms tightening around her son. "You're going to freeze to death on this bank in 10 minutes, Hayes stated, his jaw tight as the wind whipped his soaked hair across his face. "Get on the horse." He didn't wait for her permission. He reached down, grasping her by the waist of her ruined dress, and hoisted her onto the saddle with startling strength. Then he lifted the shivering child and placed him carefully in her arms. Hayes did not mount. He took the reins in his frozen hands and began to walk, leading the horse away from the river and up into the harsh, jagged embrace of the Red Rock canyons. The journey was a blur of biting wind and numbing cold. The canyon walls rose around them, blocking out the gray sky, turning the world into a maze of stone and shadows. Elu's body was shutting down. Her chin rested on Leo's head, her eyes half closed, every heartbeat a sluggish, painful effort. She didn't know where this strange, silent man was taking them, and she no longer had the strength to fight him. After what felt like hours, the wind suddenly died down. Hayes led the horse into a narrow fissure in the canyon wall, obscured by a dense thicket of dead brush. The fissure opened up into a deep, dry cave. The air inside was still, smelling faintly of dry earth and old wood ash. It was a Mustanger's hidden shelter, a place unknown to the maps and the bounty hunters. Hayes helped Alu down. Her legs gave out the moment her boots touched the ground, but he caught her before she fell, lowering her and the boy gently near a ring of blackened stones. Without a word, Hayes moved to the back of the cave, returning with an armful of dry cedar wood. Within minutes, he struck a match, and a small, bright fire cracked to life, casting a warm, golden glow against the rough stone walls. The heat felt like physical pain against Alu's freezing skin. She curled tightly around Leo, trying to force the warmth into her son's small body. Hayes shrugged off his soaked canvas coat. From a saddlebag hanging in the dry corner of the cave, he pulled out a thick, heavy wool blanket. He stepped toward Alu. She instinctively recoiled, a low sound of warning catching in her throat. Her hand dropped to her side, searching for a weapon she no longer had. Hayes stopped. He didn't speak to calm her. He simply cracked, ouched down, maintaining a respectful distance, and draped the heavy wool blanket over her trembling shoulders, making sure it covered the boy completely. As he pulled his hand back, he reached into his wet shirt pocket. He held out his rough, calloused palm. Resting in the center of his hand was the small, carved wooden horse. It was chipped and soaked, but intact. He had grabbed it from the debris on the riverbank when he pulled them from the water. Alu stared at the toy, her breath catching. Slowly, her shaking fingers reached out and took it. She looked up into Hayes's pale blue eyes, searching for the cruelty, the hidden motive, the trap. She found none, just the quiet watchfulness of a man who understood survival. He didn't ask for a thank you. He simply turned his back to her, moving toward the cave entrance to keep watch, his broad shoulders a silent barrier between them and the brutal world outside. For the first time in weeks, Alu closed her eyes, the tension in her chest easing just a fraction as the fire warmed her skin. But the brief illusion of safety was shattered only moments later. Beneath the heavy wool blanket, Leo let out a weak, rattling cough. Alu looked down. The boy was no longer just shivering from the cold. His small body was violently convulsing, his skin burning with a sudden, unnatural heat. The freezing river water had settled deep into his lungs, and the fever had arrived with terrifying speed. Leo's eyes rolled back, his breathing turning into a rapid, wet wheeze. Alu's heart stopped. She looked up at the broad back of the silent protector by the door, true terror finally breaking her hardened mask. The silence of the cave was broken by the harsh, wet rattle in Leo's chest. The boy's skin was radiating a terrifying heat, his small body rigid under the heavy wool blanket. Alu pressed her cheek against his forehead, the unnatural fire there sending a spike of pure terror straight through her heart. She looked toward the cave entrance. Hayes had turned at the sound. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He stepped fully into the dim firelight, his pale eyes assessing the child's shallow, rapid breathing. Alu tightened her grip on her son, her body tensing like a coiled spring. She had nothing left to trade, no money, no horses, no dignity left to strip away. If this man demanded payment for the shelter, for the fire, She had only her life to offer. Hayes stopped just outside her arm's reach. He looked at the boy, then at the fierce, defensive glare of the mother. Slowly, deliberately, he reached toward his thick leather belt. Elu flinched, pulling Leo closer, her breath catching in her throat. But Hayes only drew a hunting knife. He turned his broad back on them and walked straight out into the freezing sleet and darkness. For a long time, Elu sat in the flickering light, her heart hammering against her ribs. Had he abandoned them? The thought brought a strange mixture of relief and profound despair. If he left feet, they were alone in the wild, exposed and vulnerable. But if he stayed, she would have to remain constantly on guard. She rocked Leo, humming a low, ancient Apache lullaby, her voice cracking as the boy's fever dreams took hold, making him thrash against her chest. 30 minutes later, the heavy brush at the cave entrance rustled. Hayes stepped back inside. His canvas duster was soaked through again, his hair plastered to his forehead by the freezing rain. In his left hand, he held a fistful of wet, fibrous strips, the inner bark of a white willow tree, stripped fresh from the banks of a hidden creek further up the canyon. He moved to the fire without a single word. From his weathered saddlebag, he produced a battered tin cup and a heavy canteen. He poured a small amount of water into the cup, dropped the willow bark inside, and set it carefully on the hot stones near the edge of the flames. The pungent, bitter smell of boiling bark soon filled the small cavern. Elu watched him, her dark eyes tracking his every movement. She knew the medicine. Her grandmother had used the exact same bark for the sickness that burned the blood. It was the medicine of her people, gathered by the hands of a white man who refused to speak. When the brew was dark and steaming, Hayes used a piece of thick leather to pull the tin cup from the fire. He let it cool for a precise handful of minutes, testing the heat by hovering the back of his scarred hand over the rising steam. Then he crouched down and held the cup out to Elu. He didn't try to feed the boy himself. He didn't invade her space or try to touch the child. He offered the medicine and waited. Elu looked at his rough, calloused fingers gripping the tin, then up at his weathered face. The firelight cast deep shadows across his sharp jaw and the slightly crooked bridge of his nose. There was no expectation in his gaze. There was no demand for gratitude. She reached out, her trembling fingers brushing his cold knuckles as she took the cup. "Make him drink it slow," Hayes said, his voice a low gravel rumble that barely disturbed the quiet of the cave. "It'll break the fever." Elu nodded once, a sharp, dignified dip of her chin. She tilted the cup to Leo's chapped lips, coaxing the bitter liquid into his mouth. The boy coughed, twisting his head away, but she murmured to him in her native tongue, her voice a fierce, soothing anchor in the dark. Slowly, agonizingly, she managed to get half the broth down his throat. Hayes didn't linger to watch. He retreated to the cave entrance. He sat down on a flat rock, leaning his shoulders against the damp stone wall. He pulled his Winchester rifle from its leather scabbard, laying it across his knees. He faced outward, staring into the black, howling maw of the canyon. The night stretched on. The wind outside shrieked, tearing at the red rocks. But the cave remained a small, untouchable sanctuary of heat and shadow. Hours passed. Elu did not sleep, though exhaustion pulled at her eyelids like lead weights. She kept her hand resting on Leo's chest, feeling the frantic, hammering beat of his heart. Sometime past midnight, the harsh rattling in his lungs began to smooth out. The terrifying heat radiating from his skin broke into a heavy, cooling sweat. The willow bark was working. The boy's breathing deepened, settling into a natural, exhausted rhythm. He was going to live. Elu slumped against the cavern wall, a profound, aching relief washing over her. She pulled the heavy wool blanket tighter around them, realizing for the first time just how warm it was. It smelled of horsehair, wood smoke, and rain. She looked toward the entrance. Hayes had not moved an inch. He sat in the exact same position, his back to the fire, his eyes fixed on the darkness. He had not asked for a piece of the blanket. He had not moved closer to the flames to dry his own soaked clothes. He simply sat in the freezing draft, holding the line between her and the brutal world that wanted her dead. In her entire life, Elu had learned that men were either predators or cowards. This man was neither. He was a wall of stone, asking for nothing, taking nothing, simply existing as a shield. Slowly, the rigid tension that had gripped her spine for 3 days began to uncoil. She closed her eyes, the crackle of the fire a comforting rhythm against the storm. For the first time since Deacon Miller had begun his hunt, Elu allowed herself to drift into a shallow, guarded sleep. She didn't know how long she slept, but she was jolted awake by a sound that did not belong to the storm. It was sharp, distant, but unmistakably clear. Crack. Elu's eyes snapped open. She clutched Leo instinctively, the fear returning in an icy rush. At the cave entrance, Hayes was already on his feet. The rifle was no longer resting across his knees. It was gripped tightly in his hands, his thumb resting lightly on the hammer. His body was perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, listening to the wind. Another sound drifted through the canyon, the faint, rhythmic clatter of iron-shod hooves on wet stone. Hayes turned his head slightly, his pale blue eyes catching the firelight. "They found a shallow crossing," he said, his voice flat and devoid of fear. "Miller's men are on this side of the river." Hayes kicked wet sand over the small fire. The warm, golden sanctuary vanished instantly, swallowed by the brutal, freezing blackness of the cave. The sudden absence of heat felt like a physical blow to Elu, a violent reminder of the world waiting just outside the rocks. "We can't stay," Hayes said. His voice was a low vibration in the pitch black. "A fire means smoke, and smoke means a trail. If they cross the river, they'll fan out and sweep the canyon floor. We had to be on higher ground before first light." Elu didn't argue. She knew the mechanics of being hunted better than she knew the feeling of being safe. She tightened the heavy wool blanket around Leo, listening to the boy's soft, even breaths. The fever had broken, leaving him drained and limp, a dead weight in her exhausted arms. She braced herself to lift him, her muscles screaming in protest. Before she could stand, a shadow moved in front of her. Hayes stripped off his heavy, waterlogged canvas duster. Beneath it he wore nothing but a faded, wet denim shirt that clung to his muscular frame. The freezing draft howling through the cave entrance cut right through the thin cotton. But his posture did not change. He didn't even shiver. He stepped close to Elu and draped the massive coat over her shoulders. It was heavy, smelling of old leather, horse sweat, and pine needles. The residual warmth of his body clung to the lining, a shocking, intimate heat against her freezing skin. Elu looked up at him, her eyes wide in the gloom. He was completely exposed to the freezing sleet now, sacrificing his only layer of defense for a woman he didn't even know. "I can carry him," Willow whispered, her voice rough, defensive. She pulled Leo closer to her chest. "The trail up the ridge is loose shale and slick limestone," Hayes replied, his tone practical, devoid of pity. "You need your arms free to balance, or you'll fall and break your neck. Both of you." He didn't ask for permission. He reached down and gently slid his large, calloused hands under the sleeping boy. Willow's breath hitched, every maternal instinct screaming to fight, but she forced herself to release her grip. Hayes lifted Leo with impossible ease, tucking the child securely against his broad chest. He wrapped his left arm firmly around the boy's back, shielding him from the wind. With his right hand, he took the reins of the massive roan Mustang. "Stay right behind my boots," Hayes ordered. They stepped out of the cave and into the teeth of the storm. The sleet had turned into a freezing, blinding mist that clung to the towering red rock walls of the canyon. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint, jagged outlines of the cliffs against a slightly lighter shade of gray sky. The climb was brutal. The canyon floor gave way to a steep, winding switchback trail carved into the face of the stone. The ground was a treacherous slurry of freezing mud and loose shale. Every step Willow took was a battle against gravity and exhaustion. Her thin, worn moccasins provided no grip, and the jagged rocks bit through the leather, bruising her soles. But she kept her eyes locked on the back of Hayes's wet denim shirt. He moved with the silent, unnerving grace of a mountain predator, even while carrying the dead weight of a sleeping 4-year-old and leading a massive, nervous Mustang up a sheer cliff face. His boots found purchase where there seemed to be none. 10 minutes into the climb, Willow's foot slipped on a patch of wet moss. She fell hard, her knees slamming into the unforgiving rock, the breath driven from her lungs in a sharp gasp. She braced herself, waiting for the inevitable curse. She expected him to turn around and hiss at her to hurry up, to call her a burden, to threaten to leave her behind if she couldn't keep pace. That was the language of the frontier. That was how men spoke to things that slowed them down. Hayes stopped. He didn't turn around to glare at her. He didn't speak. He simply halted the Mustang, planting his boots firmly on the narrow ledge, and waited. He stood completely still in the freezing rain, acting as a windbreak for the child in his arms, giving Willow the silent space to gather her breath and her dignity. When she finally pushed herself back to her feet, her hands scraped and bleeding, he resumed climbing at a slightly slower, more deliberate pace, making sure his boots cleared a safer path in the loose rocks for her to follow. It was a small, unspoken mercy, but it struck Willow harder than the freezing rain. For 2 hours they climbed in grueling silence, ascending higher into the maze of the canyon. The roar of the distant river faded, replaced by the eerie, whistling howl of the wind rushing through the narrow stone corridors. As they reached an exposed, flat ridge near the top of the canyon wall, the sky began to bleed a bruised, dirty purple. Dawn was breaking, stripping away the cover of darkness. From deep in the valley below, a sound drifted up on the wind. Clack, clack, clack. Iron horseshoes striking stone. Hayes froze, his head tilting slightly. Willow's heart slammed against her ribs. She didn't need to speak the language of the white men to know what that sound meant. Deacon Miller's men had crossed the river. "They found a trail," Hayes murmured, his eyes scanning the vast, empty expanse of the opposite ridge. "We're You're exposed here. Keep moving to the tree line." He ushered Elu forward, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back to guide her across the open, flat expanse of the ridge. They were 50 yards from the safety of a dense grove of twisted juniper trees. 30 yards. 10 yards. Suddenly, the canyon's hollow silence was violently shattered by a deafening crack. A bullet impacted the sandstone less than an inch from Elu's right boot, exploding the rock into a shower of sharp red shrapnel that tore through the hem of her ruined calico dress. The scout had found them. The sharp, cracking echo of the gunshot had barely finished bouncing off the canyon walls before Hayes reacted. He didn't flinch. He didn't shout. With terrifying speed, he dropped the Mustang's reins, lunged toward Elu, and threw his massive body against hers. The force of his momentum carried them both hard into the dirt, rolling violently into the dense, tangled cover of the juniper grove, just as a second bullet snapped through the branches where they had been standing a fraction of a second before. Hayes dragged her behind a massive, fallen slab of red sandstone. The world smelled of pulverized rock, wet pine, and burning adrenaline. Elu was gasping, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, but her grip on Leo was like a steel vice. The child woke with a start, his eyes wide with confusion and terror, drawing in a breath to wail. Instantly, Elu clamped her hand firmly over his mouth, pulling his face into her neck. She knew the rules of the hunted. A single sound meant death. Hayes pressed his back against the sandstone, his chest rising and falling in slow, controlled measures. He looked at Elu. She was trembling, covered in red dust and freezing mud, holding her child in a death grip, but her dark eyes were fiercely locked on his. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't panicked. He gave her a single, curt nod of approval. "Scout," Hayes whispered, his voice so low it was barely a vibration in the air. He fired early, got greedy for the bounty. The rest of Miller's men are still down in the valley, but they'll be coming fast now. He slid his Winchester rifle from his shoulder, checking the chamber with a quiet, practiced click. Then he pointed to a narrow, dark fissure in the rock wall behind them, heavily concealed by the thick juniper branches. "Get in there. Do not come out, no matter what you hear. Keep the boy completely quiet." Elu scrambled backward into the crevice, dragging the heavy canvas duster Hayes had given her to cover Leo. The space was suffocatingly tight, smelling of dry earth and old roots, but it offered absolute cover. She pressed herself into the furthest corner, peering out through a small gap in the rocks. She watched Hayes. He did not raise his rifle and wait for a shootout. Instead, he reached down and unbuckled his heavy leather spurs, laying them silently on the dirt. He checked the hunting knife at his belt. Then the man simply melted away. 1 second he was crouched behind the sandstone. The next he was gone, slipping into the gray, freezing mist and the dense brush without snapping a single twig. It was entirely unnatural for a man of his size to move with such absolute silence. Elu held her breath, the heavy silence of the canyon pressing down on her eardrums. 5 minutes passed. 10. The sleet continued to hiss against the rocks. Then she saw a shadow move. 50 feet away, a man stepped out from behind a twisted pine. He held a repeating rifle raised to his shoulder, his eyes darting frantically through the grove. He wore a heavy wool coat with a deputy's star pinned to the collar, though the star was just an excuse for legalized murder. He was tracking their footprints in the mud, closing the distance to the sandstone slab with slow, agonizing steps. He stopped directly adjacent to the rock where Hayes had been hiding. He lowered his rifle slightly, leaning forward to inspect the scuffed dirt. He never even had the chance to draw a breath. Hayes dropped from the low, overhanging branch of a dead juniper directly above the scout. It was a descent of pure, calculated violence. Before the man's boots could even scrape the gravel to turn, Hayes's left arm wrapped around his throat like a steel cable, instantly crushing his windpipe and cutting off any chance of a scream. Simultaneously, Hayes's right hand clamped over the receiver of the scout's rifle, preventing the man from firing a blind warning shot. The struggle was brutally short and entirely silent. The scout thrashed wildly, his boots kicking up dirt, but Hayes was an immovable force. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying concentration. He didn't use his knife. He simply applied relentless, crushing pressure until the scout's eyes rolled back and his body went entirely limp. Hayes lowered the unconscious man to the ground without a sound, expertly stripping him of his rifle and the revolver at his hip, tossing the weapons into the deep brush. From her hiding place in the rocks, Elu watched with wide, disbelieving eyes. A cold shiver that had nothing to do with the weather traced its way down her spine. The sheer, overwhelming lethality of the man was staggering. He had dismantled a heavily armed tracker in seconds, with bare hands, without making a sound. He was not just a Mustanger, he was an apex predator. And for the first time, Elu truly understood the magnitude of the shield she had been placed behind. If Hayes Corlett had wanted to harm them, she would never have seen it coming. But as Hayes dragged the unconscious scout into the thicket to hide the body, a new sound echoed up from the canyon floor. It was a voice, magnified by the natural acoustic amphitheater of the towering red walls, booming upward with terrifying clarity. "Well now, I see you up there, Mustanger." Deacon Miller's voice echoed, dripping with a venomous, mocking cheerfulness. "I found where your horse scrambled up the bank." Hayes froze in the brush, his head tilting toward the valley. In the crevice, Elu pulled Leo tighter against her chest, her heart sinking. They were trapped. "I know exactly who you are," Deacon's voice boomed again, rolling over the rocks like thunder. "Did you tell her, Hayes? Did you tell that little Apache girl who's keeping her company?" Hayes stepped out from the brush, his jaw tight, his pale eyes burning as he looked down over the cliff edge. "You trusting Hayes Corlett, girl?" Deacon shouted, his words designed to slice through the cold wind and plant the ultimate seed of poison. "Ask him why he lives out here all alone. Ask him what happened to his own flesh and blood. He left his own brother to die in the dirt to save his own skin. He's a rabid dog, girl. He'll use you as bait and leave you to bleed the second my boys get close." The words echoed violently against the stone, lingering in the freezing mist. Hayes stood perfectly still, his broad back facing Elu's hiding spot. He didn't yell back, he didn't deny it, but Elu saw his massive shoulders tense, his knuckles turning stark white as his hand drifted toward the heavy revolver at his hip. The canyon swallowed Deacon Miller's poisonous words, but their cruel echo seemed to linger in the freezing mist. In the narrow rock crevice, Elu watched the broad back of the Mustanger. She held Leo so tightly her arms ached. her mind racing through a maze of terror and doubt. Did he leave his own blood to die? In a world where survival often meant stepping on the weak, it was a terrifyingly common truth. If a man could abandon his own brother to save his own skin, what would he do to a hunted Apache woman and her half-blood child when the bullets started flying? The frontier was built on broken promises. Deacon's lie was designed to rot Alu's trust from the inside out, to make her panic and run directly into their crosshairs. Hayes slowly turned around. The pale blue of his eyes caught the dim gray light of the storm. He didn't look angry. He didn't look like a man cornered by a shameful past. He looked profoundly, devastatingly tired. He walked back to the sandstone slab, moving with that same eerie, silent grace, and crouched down in the dirt directly in front of the narrow fissure where Alu hid. He didn't offer a defense. He didn't raise his voice to explain away the bounty hunter's taunt. In the brutal frontier, words were the currency of liars, politicians, and cowards. Hayes Corlett was none of those things. Instead, he reached to the small of his back, beneath the wet denim of his shirt, and drew a second, smaller revolver, a short-barreled Colt. It was a close-quarters weapon, heavy, well-oiled, and lethal. He held it out to her, grip first. Alu stared at the dark iron, her breath catching in her throat. To give a hunted Apache woman a loaded gun was unheard of. In the eyes of the law, she was property, a bounty to be collected. Handing her a weapon was an act of absolute surrender, a transfer of power that completely shattered the bounty hunter's poisonous lie. A man planning to use her as bait would never, under any circumstances, arm her. Slowly, her trembling hand reached out from beneath the heavy canvas duster. Her bruised fingers wrapped around the checkered wood grip. The metal was still warm from his body heat. "There are 5 bullets in the cylinder," Hayes said, his voice a low, rough rumble that barely disturbed the freezing air. He looked at the sleeping boy, then back to her fierce, dark eyes. "If anyone comes through that brush and it ain't me, you empty it. You don't hesitate. You don't ask questions." Alu nodded, her jaw set tight to keep her teeth from chattering. "And you?" "I'm going to give them a trail to follow," Hayes replied. He pulled a spare box of brass cartridges from his pocket and set it gently on the dry dirt beside her knee. "They're tracking the horse. I'll take the Mustang and lead them up the high switchback toward the dead pass. It'll draw Deacon and the rest of his dogs away from this ridge. They won't look twice at this grove once they see me break cover." Alu's heart slammed against her ribs. She knew the geography of these red rocks. There is no way out of the dead pass. It is a blind wall. "I know," Hayes said simply. He was offering himself as the ultimate decoy. He was going to ride into a box canyon, intentionally trapping himself, just to pull the hounds away from the rabbit. "Why?" Alu whispered, the word tearing from her throat before she could stop it. The desperation in her voice sounded entirely foreign to her. "Why do this for us?" Hayes paused. His large, calloused hand rested on the freezing sandstone as he prepared to stand. The wind howled through the twisted junipers, whipping his wet hair across his scarred forehead. "Because Deacon was half right," Hayes murmured, his tone carrying a heavy, bleeding weight that seemed older than the mountains around them. "I was a coward once. I won't be one today." He didn't wait for her to respond. He stood up, turning his back on the only safe place left on the ridge. He walked over to the massive roan Mustang, grabbed the thick leather reins, and swung his exhausted body onto the wet saddle. He didn't look back at it. He crevice. With a sharp click of his tongue, he urged the horse out of the juniper grove. He didn't move silently this time. He deliberately broke dead branches, allowing the iron horseshoes to scrape loudly against the exposed rock. He was painting a massive, undeniable target on his own back. A minute later, from down in the valley, a triumphant shout erupted through the mist. "There! Up on the high ridge! He's making a run for the dead pass! Get after him!" The chaotic sound of scrambling horses, snapping leather, and yelling men echoed up the canyon walls. Deacon Miller's posse had taken the bait, consumed by their own bloodlust and greed. In the dark, suffocating crevice, Elu pulled Leo tight against her chest, the heavy Colt revolver gripped firmly in her right hand. She listened as the sound of Hayes's Mustang faded higher into the treacherous red rocks, followed closely by the thunderous pursuit of the bounty hunters. She was safe. Her son was safe. The silence of the juniper grove returned, heavy and absolute, broken only by the hiss of the freezing rain. But Elu did not feel relief. She felt a profound, agonizing ache in her chest. For the first time in her life, a man had stepped between her and death, demanding nothing in return. And now he was riding toward his own execution just to keep her hidden. An hour passed. Sleet turned to a heavy, driving snow. It rapidly blanketed the red rocks in a layer of blinding white. The freezing temperature was becoming lethal, even with the heavy canvas duster and the shelter of the rocks. Leo shivered violently in his sleep, his small breaths puffing into white clouds. Elu kept the gun aimed at the opening, her entire body rigid with cold and dread. Then, from high above them, echoing down the sheer, icy walls of the dead pass, came the sounds Elu had been dreading. Gunfire, not a single precise warning shot, but a chaotic, overlapping roar of repeating rifles and heavy revolvers. The violent echoes bounced off the stone, mixing with the faint screams of frightened horses and the ominous, rumbling clatter of falling rock. Hayes' Corlett had been cornered against the wall. The chaotic roar of gunfire echoing down the canyon walls was a visceral, terrifying sound. In the suffocating darkness of the rock crevice, Elu squeezed her eyes shut, pulling Leo so tightly against her chest that the boy whimpered in his sleep. She gripped the heavy Colt revolver with her right hand, her finger resting rigidly outside the trigger guard. Every gunshot sounded like a death sentence. Every echo felt like a physical blow. She knew how men like Deacon Miller operated. They didn't fight fair. They didn't offer honorable duels. They swarmed, they overwhelmed, and they slaughtered. And Hayes Corlett was a massive, lethal man. But he was just one man against a posse of armed bounty hunters in a bottleneck canyon with no exit. The mass of the frontier was brutal and absolute. He was dying up there, bleeding out on the freezing red rocks, simply to buy her time. High above, in the treacherous confines of the dead pass, the reality of the situation was entirely different. Hayes had not ridden into a trap. He had ridden into his own domain. The dead pass was a sheer box canyon, surrounded on three sides by 80-foot walls of vertical limestone. It was the exact location Hayes used to corral the wild mustangs he tracked. Across the narrowest point of the canyon, he had spent months building a massive, reinforced barricade of woven pine logs and thick rope. Behind that barricade, 30 terrified, unbroken wild horses were trapped, driven into a frenzy by the freezing storm, the lightning, and the deafening crack of the bounty hunters' rifles. Deacon Miller and his 5 men rode aggressively into the narrow funnel of the pass, their repeating rifles raised, smelling blood. They saw Hayes dismounted, standing perfectly still in front of the massive brush gate. He was completely cornered. Behind him was a sheer drop. To his sides, vertical rock. Deacon halted his horse, a cruel, victorious grin splitting his weathered face. He raised his hand, signaling his men to fan out across the narrow passage, blocking any impossible chance of escape. "Well, look at the big bad Mustanger now," Deacon spat, his voice echoing loudly in the enclosed space. "You out of tricks, Corlett? You should have stayed out of my business. Now you're gonna die in the dirt for an Apache stray." Hayes didn't draw his rifle. He didn't reach for his knife. He stood in the freezing sleet, his pale blue eyes completely devoid of fear. He looked at Deacon with the cold, detached observation of a man looking at a corpse. "I'm not trapped in here with you, Deacon," Hayes said, his low, gravelly voice barely carried over the wind. But the absolute lack of panic in it made the bounty hunter's horse nervously shift its weight. Hayes took one deliberate step to the side. He raised his Winchester rifle from his hip, but he didn't aim it at the men. He aimed it at the thick, taut primary rope holding the heavy pine barricade together. "You're trapped in here with them," Hayes whispered. He pulled the trigger. The heavy bullet severed the tension rope in a single, violent snap. The massive wooden gate, already groaning under the weight of 30 panicked Mustangs, instantly buckled and collapsed outward. The sound that followed was not gunfire. It was the terrifying, earth-shattering thunder of an avalanche of muscle and bone. 30 wild, unbroken horses, driven completely mad by the storm and the scent of blood, erupted from the corral. They surged forward like a tidal wave of hooves, teeth, and raw power, pouring directly into the narrow bottleneck of the pass where Deacon and his men were sitting. There was no time to turn around. There was no space to retreat. Deacon's confident grin vanished, replaced by a scream of pure, unadulterated terror. "Move! Get back! Back!" But the stampede was already upon them. The wild Mustangs crashed into the posse's horses with the force of a freight train. The canyon was instantly filled with the sickening crunch of bone, the frantic screams of men, and the chaotic squealing of animals. Bounty hunters were violently thrown from their saddles, trampled into the freezing mud beneath 100 iron-hard hooves. Deacon's horse reared in sheer panic, throwing the bounty hunter hard against the jagged canyon wall. His rifle clattered uselessly into the dirt as a massive black stallion trampled over his leg, snapping the bone with a sickening crack. Deacon screamed, dragging himself into a shallow ditch, completely broken and humiliated by the very wildness he thought he could conquer. Hayes stood safely on a high ledge beside the broken gate, watching the carnage with cold, unblinking eyes. He didn't fire another shot. The mountain had exacted its own vengeance. Down in the juniper grove, Elu felt the earth tremble. The rumbling vibration traveled through the sandstone, shaking dust loose from the roof of her crevice. She clutched Leo, holding her breath. The gunfire had completely stopped. The rumbling slowly faded into the howling wind, leaving behind a heavy, ringing silence. The snow continued to fall, thick and blinding, blanketing the red rocks in a shroud of white. Elu waited. Her hands were numb, her arm shaking from the weight of the Colt revolver. The silence dragged on for an agonizing 20 minutes. The cold was beginning to seep through the heavy canvas duster, chilling Leo's small body. Then she heard it. Crunch, crunch. Heavy boots stepping deliberately through the fresh snow. Elu's heart leaped into her throat. She pushed herself slightly forward, raising the heavy revolver with both hands, aiming it squarely at the gap in the brush. She thumbed back the hammer with a loud click. If it was Deacon, she would empty the cylinder just as she was told. She would not miss. The brush parted slowly. A massive figure stepped through the freezing mist. Elu's breath caught. Her finger tightened on the trigger, the metal biting into her cold skin. It was Hayes. He was breathing heavily, his broad chest rising and falling in deep, exhausted measures. He was covered in freezing mud and red dust. His left arm hung slightly awkwardly at his side, and Elu's sharp eyes immediately caught the dark, wet stain of fresh blood seeping through the soaked denim fabric near his bicep, a grazing bullet from the chaotic crossfire before the stampede. He stopped a few feet from the crevice, looking down the barrel of his own gun. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't order her to lower the weapon. He simply looked at her, his pale blue eyes steady and calm, waiting for her fear to subside. Elu stared at him, the reality of the moment crashing over her. He had come back. He had faced down a posse of armed killers, bled for her, and walked back through a blizzard just to ensure she was safe. Slowly, her hands began to shake violently. The heavy Colt lowered, dipping toward the snow. She uncocked the hammer with a trembling thumb and let the weapon drop from her numb fingers. She leaned her head back against the cold stone, a single hot tear carving a path through the dirt on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of fear. It was the overwhelming, crushing weight of relief. Hayes stepped forward, crouching down in front of the narrow gap. He reached out with his uninjured right hand, not to take the gun, but to pull the heavy canvas duster tighter around her and the sleeping boy. "They won't follow us anymore," Hayes said quietly, his voice a warm, steady anchor in the freezing storm. "It's over." The storm broke by mid-morning of the second day, leaving the rugged territory buried under a blinding layer of pristine, undisturbed snow. The harsh angles of the red rock canyons were softened, the violent world temporarily silenced by the freezing white blanket. They rode out of the dead pass slowly. Hayes walked through the knee-deep snow, leading the massive roan Mustang by the reins. He had insisted allure he'd. She sat in the saddle, wrapped tightly in his heavy canvas duster, holding Leo against her chest. The boy's fever had completely broken, leaving him weak and quiet. His small fingers curled tightly around the chipped wooden horse. Hayes moved with a pronounced limp, his left arm bound tightly against his chest, with a strip torn from his own shirt. The bullet graze had bled sluggishly through the night, but he had refused to stop, pushing them relentlessly out of the canyon maze before Deacon's remaining men, if there were any brave enough to try, could regroup. By dusk, the jagged silhouette of a frontier border station emerged through the pine trees. It wasn't a town, merely a rugged outpost built of heavy timber, a trading post, a livery, and a boarding house clustered together against the harsh wind. Smoke curled invitingly from a stone chimney, promising the kind of heat that could save a life. As they approached the main building, a small crowd of freighters, miners, and travelers gathered on the wooden porch, their attention drawn by the massive Mustang and the battered man leading it. The conversations died down, replaced by a tense, hostile silence. In the frontier, safety was a luxury afforded only to those who belonged. The station master, a stout man with a thick gray beard and a heavy shotgun resting casually in the crook of his arm, stepped out from the warm doorway. His eyes swept over Hayes, noting the blood and the sheer exhaustion before landing on the saddle. The moment he saw Elu, her dark hair, her copper skin, the traditional cut of her ruined moccasins beneath the duster, his expression hardened into a mask of pure frontier prejudice. He saw the half-blood child in her arms. He saw trouble. He saw someone who was not legally considered a person, but a liability. "Keep walking, mister," the station master barked, his voice loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear. "We don't want that kind of trouble here. You can buy supplies from the window, but the squaw and the half-breed don't set foot inside. I run a respectable house." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the men on the porch. A few of them smirked, leaning against the wooden rail, waiting to see the exhausted traveler abandon his burden for a hot meal and a warm bed. It was the way of the world. A man didn't freeze for a stray. Elu stiffened in the saddle. The biting cold of the crowd's stares was worse than the river water. Her chin lifted instinctively, her dark eyes flashing with an unbreakable dignity. She would not beg. She would not let her son see her humiliated. She tightened her grip on the reins, fully prepared to turn the horse back into the freezing wilderness and die with her pride intact. Before she could move, Hayes let go of the horse's lead. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't shout. He simply walked forward, his heavy, snow-covered boots thudding against the wooden steps of the porch. The crowd instinctively parted. There was something terrifying about the way he moved, a slow, immovable momentum that radiated pure, suppressed violence. His face was pale from blood loss, his jaw covered in dark stubble, but his pale blue eyes locked onto the station master with a lethal, unblinking focus. He stopped 2 feet from the barrel of the shotgun. "You're going to open that door," Hayes said. His voice was not raised, but the low, gravelly rumble cut through the freezing air like a serrated blade. The station master swallowed hard, his grip tightening nervously on the weapon. He tried to puff out his chest, relying on the backing of the crowd. "Listen here, friend. The law says I don't have to serve, no. I don't care about your law," Hayes interrupted, his voice dropping into a deadly whisper that carried across the silent porch. "My name is Hayes Corlett. You look at my face and you ask yourself if a warm bed is worth dying for in the snow." The name hung in the air, a collective breath caught in the throats of the men on the porch. The Mustanger, the man the territory whispered about, the one who tracked wild beasts because human company disgusted him, the man who had supposedly broken an entire posse of bounty hunters in a single night. The station master's face drained of color. His eyes darted from Hayes's cold gaze to the fresh blood soaking the man's sleeve, realizing with absolute certainty that this man had just walked out of a slaughter and was fully prepared to start another. Slowly, shakily, the station master lowered the shotgun. He took a step back, pulling the heavy wooden door open. The warm, golden light of the fire spilled out onto the snow. "No trouble, Mr. Corlett," the man stammered, looking at the floorboards. "No trouble at all. The fire is yours." Hayes didn't thank him. He turned his back on the intimidated crowd and walked back to the Mustang. He reached up with his good arm, wrapping it firmly around Ilu's waist, and lifted her down from the saddle. He didn't ask her to walk. He kept his arm securely around her side, sheltering her from the stares of the men as he guided her up the steps. He carried the bags. He carried the weight of the crowd's judgment. He formed a living shield between the cruel world and the woman beside him. They stepped inside. The door shut firmly behind them, cutting off the bitter wind and the cold eyes of the frontier. The room was vast and quiet, dominated by a massive stone hearth crackling with burning pine. Hayes guided Ilu to a heavy wooden chair pulled close to the flames. She sat down, her body trembling uncontrollably as the heat finally began to thaw her frozen bones. Hayes didn't sit. He stood between her and the rest of the room, his back to the fire, watching a few other patrons until they quickly found reasons to look away and retreat to their rooms. Only when the common area was entirely empty did his broad shoulders finally drop a fraction of an inch. He pulled up a small wooden stool and sat heavily, resting his injured arm on his knee. Ilu looked at him. The firelight danced across his weathered face, highlighting the deep exhaustion etched into his skin. He had fought a river, climbed a mountain in a blizzard, slaughtered a posse, and faced down a mob, all without asking her for a single word of gratitude. Leo stirred in her lap. The boy blinked sleepily in the warm light. He looked at Hayes, then held out his small hand. In his palm was the carved wooden horse, chipped and water-damaged, but still whole. Hayes looked at the toy. A faint, incredibly rare softness touched the corners of his pale blue eyes. He reached out with his rough, calloused fingers and gently pushed the wooden horse back toward the boy's chest. "Keep it safe, little man," Hayes murmured. Ilu felt a sudden, overwhelming tightness in her throat. The walls of her defensive cage, built over a lifetime of betrayal and survival, finally crumbled. She reached out, her small bronze hand gently covering his large, bruised knuckles. It was the first time she had touched him willingly. Hayes looked up. Their eyes met over the sleeping child. No promises were spoken. No romantic vows were declared. In a brutal, unforgiving world, words were cheap. But the silence between them was an unbreakable vow. She was no longer hunted. She was no longer property. She had found the only safe place left in the territory, and it wasn't a town or a cabin or a piece of paper. It was him. In a world that demands everything and gives nothing, true protection isn't found in grand speeches. It's found in the quiet strength of a man who refuses to walk away. If you believe that the deepest kind of love is built on a foundation of unyielding safety and mercy, leave a like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, would you have trusted the Mustanger? Share this story with someone who appreciates the beauty of finding one safe place in a harsh world.